They called him a mess attendant, a cook, a cleaner, a servant in uniform. He wore the same navy blues as every other man on the USS West Virginia, but the rules were clear. His job wasn't to fight. It was to serve the men who did. December 7, 1941, a Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. The smell of breakfast still lingered in the galley when the first wave hit. Bombs fell like thunderclaps. Steel twisted. Oil ignited. Ships cracked open like tin cans. And in that instant when death came roaring down from the sky, Dory Miller stopped being what the Navy told him he was. He became what history would never forget. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not on a gun. Not in the fight. Not standing shoulder to shoulder with sailors trained for combat. Because he was black. Because in 1941, the Navy believed men like Dory Miller didn't belong behind a trigger. They told him, "Your place is in the mess hall." But history doesn't ask for permission. When the torpedoes slammed into the West Virginia, Miller was below deck, doing the job he was allowed to do. But when the ship began to list, and fire swallowed compartments whole, he ran topside through smoke and shrapnel, not away from the chaos but into it. He was built like a linebacker, powerful, calm, precise. On the football field, back in Waco, Texas, they'd called him a force of nature. But this wasn't Texas. This was war. And this was a crucible that no training, no manual, no rank could ever prepare a man for. He helped lift the ship's mortally wounded captain, Mervyn Bennion, out of harm's way, dodging debris, pulling others to safety, all while Japanese planes kept tearing through the sky. Then, he saw the .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun mounted, and manned, and unclaimed. He had never been trained to fire it. No one had shown him how. But that didn't stop him. Because instinct doesn't wait for orders. Because courage doesn't need credentials. He grabbed the handles and aimed toward the sky. And then he pulled the trigger. Fury erupted from the barrels. Tracer rounds carved red lines into the clouds. Enemy Zeros screamed past, strafing the decks. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Dory Miller firing back. Witnesses say he was relentless. Calm, focused, deadly. He tracked the planes with the precision of a seasoned gunner. He downed one, then another. Some say 3, some say 4. No one agrees on the exact number. But everyone agrees on this. He should never have been on that gun. And thank God he was. The official Navy report when it finally came acknowledged Miller's actions but didn't name him. At first, he was just an unnamed Negro mess attendant. That's how deep the racism ran. Even heroism couldn't outrun it. But the black press wouldn't let the story die. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and voices across Black America demanded the truth be known, demanded the man behind the trigger be recognized. And slowly, the silence cracked. In May 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz pinned the Navy Cross, America's second highest award for valor, on Dory Miller's chest. It was a moment as symbolic as it was overdue. Not just a medal, but a defiance of the very system that had tried to keep him invisible. Still, they sent him back to non-combat duties, back to the shadows of service. No promotion. No officer training. No elevation beyond the role the Navy had originally carved out for men like him. Because in 1942, medals didn't break chains. Even after becoming a national hero, Miller's reality didn't change much. He still wore the same uniform. Still carried trays. Still faced the same quiet dismissal that had always stalked black servicemen in a segregated military. But others noticed. Young black Americans saw something in Dory Miller. They saw possibility. They saw themselves not just in kitchens or cabins but on the bridge, on the battlefield, at the trigger of a machine gun, because what he proved couldn't be unproved. The Navy had tried to argue that combat required more than instinct, that courage wasn't enough, that black men couldn't handle responsibility under fire. But one Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor had burned all that to ash. They couldn't explain away what Dory Miller had done. They couldn't file it under coincidence or lucky timing. It was bravery, pure and simple. In 1943, he was reassigned to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay, a small ship in a vast ocean, and on November 24th, a Japanese torpedo found her. The ship exploded. Most of the crew went down with her, Dory Miller among them. He died the way he lived, serving in silence, without glory, without the rank or recognition he deserved. But he never disappeared. Not really. In the decades that followed, the Navy started naming things after him. Buildings. Streets, eventually, a ship, and now a Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier bears his name. CVN-81, the USS Doris Miller, a ship of war, a ship of power, A ship named not for a general, not for a politician but for a mess attendant who picked up a machine gun and changed history. His name is taught now. His face shown in museums. But more importantly, his legacy has cracked the foundations of the institution that once denied him. Because in the end, Dory Miller didn't just fire a gun. He fired a warning shot into the heart of segregation. He dared the system to look at him, to see him, to reckon with the truth that bravery doesn't wear a particular skin. It bleeds. It burns. It endures. He didn't have to fight. They didn't want him to. But when the bullets fell and the ship burned, he fought anyway. Not because he was trained. Not because he was told to. But because he knew. Because deep down, even in a nation that treated him as less, he still believed it was his duty to protect it. And that contradiction, that impossible grace, is what makes his story unforgettable. He lived in a navy that denied him the right to serve as a full man. And yet, he served more fully than most ever will. They called him just a cook. He answered with fire. They gave him scraps of recognition. He gave them a legacy. In the quiet moments before the bombs fell, he was invisible. By the time the smoke cleared, he had become a legend. Not for what he was allowed to do, but for what he did anyway. And in that, there's something bigger than war. Bigger than race. Bigger than policy or protocol or prejudice. There's the truth, that history is often written by those never meant to survive it. And sometimes, heroes rise not because they're chosen but because they choose themselves. And once a man chooses himself, no institution, no silence, no hierarchy built on centuries of prejudice can ever put him back in the box they built for him. But it wasn't just the Navy that had to take a long, hard look after Pearl Harbor. It was the whole country. Because when the smoke cleared, when the dead were counted and the war drums beat louder, America was forced to ask, what kind of nation sends black men to serve but not to fight? To wear the uniform but not the dignity that comes with it? To die for freedom but never taste it? Dory Miller was no political theorist. He didn't carry protest signs or file lawsuits. He carried trays. Then he carried wounded men. Then he carried a .50 caliber machine gun like it was a natural extension of his own spine. But without saying a word, he issued a challenge. To every admiral, every politician, every American who had been comfortable with a military that fought for liberty abroad while enforcing segregation at home. And that challenge couldn't be ignored anymore. Not after December 7th. Not after Dory Miller. Because when the news finally spread, when his name was printed in newspapers, when photographs of that strong-jawed sailor from Waco hit front pages, it ignited something. Pride. Anger, hope. Black communities already knew about sacrifice. They already knew what it meant to give everything and get nothing. But here, in the middle of the Pacific, on a day that would live in infamy, a man they weren't supposed to remember had become impossible to forget. That's what scared the system the most. Because Dory Miller wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol, proof, undeniable evidence that talent, courage, and leadership had been buried under racism for generations. And if one man could expose that truth with 15 minutes of fire and fury, how many more were waiting? How many others had been silenced, overlooked, or kept in the shadows, not because they lacked the ability, but because the rules were written to keep them small? The answer was too big to ignore. And it started to seep into the halls of power. It would take years, decades, even, but the wheels began to turn. The same Navy that once said, Negroes can serve, but not lead, would slowly begin to open its doors. Reluctantly, unevenly, but permanently. It would take executive orders, court rulings, protests, and another world war's worth of pressure. But the crack had formed. And it started with a man they hadn't even wanted to name. The irony is cruel, isn't it? A nation built on the promise of equality had to be reminded by a mess attendant with no training that skin color doesn't determine courage. That patriotism isn't measured by privilege. That sometimes, the most American act isn't waving a flag or quoting the Constitution. It's standing your ground when no one expects you to. When no one wants you to. That's what Dory Miller did. Not for a medal. Not for a promotion that would never come. But because, in the deepest part of himself, he knew what was right. And in that moment, that clarity, that split-second decision to pick up a gun and defend his shipmates, it pierced straight through the smog of military bureaucracy and institutional racism. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. That wasn't in the Navy's plan. But history doesn't care about plans. History cares about moments. And that morning, under that sky, with bombs falling and steel burning, a moment found Dory Miller. He rose to meet it. And still they tried to shrink his legacy, to box it in with footnotes and vague mentions. To celebrate the act, but not the man. You can feel it in the way he was remembered during the war. A symbol of good behavior, a token in recruitment posters, an inspiration, sure but never too big. Never big enough to challenge the narrative that the system had already built. But the people who looked like him knew better. They didn't need official statements or grainy photographs to understand what they were seeing. They saw the quiet rage in his silence. They saw the pride in his posture, the defiance in the way he stood behind that machine gun and claimed a space that was never meant for him. They saw themselves. Every black parent who had sent a son to serve. Every young man told, don't aim too high. Every little girl raised in the shadow of to flags the stars and stripes, and the unspoken warning that some liberties still weren't meant for everyone. They saw a man who made his mark not by asking for respect, but by earning it in fire. By taking it. And isn't that the heart of it? Dory Miller didn't ask. He acted. He didn't wait for permission. He made history wait for him. There's a quiet brutality in how short his life was. Gone at 24. No second act. No memoir. No interviews. Just the smoke, the fire, the fury, and then the silence. But maybe that's why his story echoes louder. Because it wasn't diluted by decades of interpretation. It wasn't polished. It wasn't softened for public consumption. It was raw, immediate, undeniable. And maybe that's why, decades later, when the Navy announced that the next Ford-class aircraft carrier would bear his name, not another president, not another admiral, but a black mess attendant from Texas, it felt like something had finally caught up. Because a ship like that, a floating city of steel, bristling with power, unstoppable in the water, isn't just a war machine. It's a message. And when it bears the name Doris Miller, that message is crystal clear. This is who we are now. And this is who we owe. It's no consolation for the life he never got to finish. But it's something. It's a promise that his name will sail across oceans. That school children will ask, who was Doris Miller? And someone will say, he wasn't supposed to be a hero. He just became one anyway. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for. To be more than what the world expects of us. To rise when others fall. To stand when it's easier to run. To seize the moment when it comes roaring through smoke and fire. He didn't write speeches. He didn't sit at any table of power. But in 15 desperate minutes, he told a nation everything it needed to hear without speaking a word. And long after the guns went silent, long after the headlines faded, that message remains. A mess attendant, a son of sharecroppers, a sailor, a man who saw the sky falling and decided he would not go quietly. Not today. Not ever. And because of that choice, because of his choice, the next generation of black servicemen didn't have to fight just to be seen. They could fight to lead, to command, to rise. He didn't live to see it, but he made it possible. And maybe that's what greatness is. Not the medals, not the rank, but the legacy that outlives you. The ripples you send through time, the doors you blast open for people you'll never meet. Dory Miller was told he didn't belong. He answered with gunfire. He was told to stay in the background. He became the front line. He was told he wasn't worthy. He proved them wrong. Forever. You hear about legends. You read about heroes. But every once in a while, one walks into history so loudly that even a nation built on silence can't drown him out. Dory Miller wasn't born for headlines. He wasn't raised in the glow of privilege or pedigree. He came from Waco, Texas, Jim Crow country, a place where black boys learned young to step aside, look down, speak carefully. But inside him burned something old, something deep, something no system could ever quite choke out. He grew up working the land, the son of sharecroppers. The world told him what he was, what he wasn't. He was told he wasn't smart enough to lead, wasn't capable of complex tasks, wasn't fit to wear anything but an apron or a mop. And when he joined the Navy in 1939, the same voices echoed. They gave him a tray, not a rifle, assigned him to clean uniforms, not wear them with distinction, to serve meals, not defend a nation. Because in the Navy's eyes, black men were labor, not leaders. But racism has a funny way of underestimating the very people it fears. It builds walls, and then panics when someone kicks them down. Dory Miller didn't just break a rule that day at Pearl Harbor. He shattered a myth. The myth that bravery could be confined to skin. The myth that loyalty came with conditions. The myth that some men were born to fight, while others were born to serve them. You can imagine the silence that followed. The discomfort in high command. A black mess attendant manning a .5 Ocala and dropping enemy aircraft. That wasn't supposed to happen. There was no script for that. No protocol. They had categories for sailors like Miller. But courage doesn't fit into categories. He had no training. No orders. No permission. He just saw death raining down and decided to do something about it. That instinct that fire is what they hadn't counted on, and what they couldn't erase. They tried to keep his name out of the press, said they were investigating, said more information was needed, said there were other heroes to focus on. But Black America already knew. They knew what it meant when a man like Dory Miller stood tall in a storm of steel and fire. They knew it because they had been doing the same thing, quietly, invisibly, for generations, fighting wars they weren't allowed to win, showing loyalty to a country that didn't return it. And still they showed up. Still, they believed. Still, they bled. Because they believed in the idea of America, even when the reality of America shut the door in their face. Miller's story wasn't just about that one day. It was about every day. Every time a black sailor walked onto a base and was told to clean rather than train. Every time he was passed over. Every time he was reminded without words that he could die for his country, but not be seen by it. The Navy Cross was a victory, yes, but it was also a concession, a forced acknowledgement that something incredible had happened, something too big to ignore, something they didn't know how to frame, because it wasn't supposed to happen in the world they had built. They gave him the medal, but they never gave him a second chance. He went back to laundry, back to hauling gear, back to the shadows. No promotion, no reassignment to gunnery school, no pathway forward, in the hearts of those who refused to forget. And as the years rolled on, something began to shift. Because you can only lie to yourself for so long. You can only deny greatness before the weight of your own hypocrisy starts to crush you. By the time the military desegregated in 1948, the ghost of Dory Miller was already marching ahead of them. He'd become the face of what they could no longer ignore. Proof that the only thing limiting black servicemen was the system built to keep them small. Every black sailor who rose through the ranks after that, every officer, every commander, every pilot, every SEAL carried a piece of Dory Miller with them. Even if they didn't say his name. Even if they didn't know his story. Because he made the crack. He shook the walls. Not with protests. Not with speeches. But with bullets fired from a deck swallowed in fire. And that's why his name matters. Not just in Navy history, but in American history. Because Dory Miller didn't just fight the Japanese that day. He fought a deeper enemy. An enemy wearing a familiar face. An enemy that didn't drop bombs, but built barriers. If you enjoyed this, tap like, subscribe, and share. It tells the algorithm that this content matters, and it helps us keep creating more.